Well, the topic is the disagreement between Mises and Milton Friedman on economic method. I'm going to talk about two differences, two disagreements, but I think that ultimately these rest on the same thing. The first disagreement is one that's already been mentioned in an earlier lecture, which is Friedman's critique of a priorism. His view that if you believe in basing economics on a priori principles rather than on empirical discoveries, that there's something illegitimate about that. There's this famous quote from Friedman. There are many different versions of the quote because he said it over and over, but here's one of them. Friedman said, "If you and I are both praxeologists and we disagree about whether some proposition or statement is correct, how do we resolve that disagreement? We can yell, we can argue, we can try to find a logical flaw in one another's thing. But in the end, we have no way to resolve it except by fighting, by saying you're wrong and I'm right. On the other hand, if you take more like a Karl Popperian approach, I say to you, what facts can I find that will convince you I was right and you were wrong? Then we go out and observe the facts. That's how science progresses." So that's Friedman's argument, and here he's appealing to you have Karl Popper, a famous philosopher of science, who was very concerned about distinguishing genuine science from pseudoscience. And what Popper thought was that a lot of pseudoscience masqueraded as science by having statements that couldn't be tested, in particular statements that were unfalsifiable. And Popper accused theories like Marxism and Freudianism of having this flaw. So what Popper claimed was that nothing was ever allowed to count against these theories. That if you hate your father, it's a sign you've got an Oedipus complex. If you don't hate your father, that's a sign that you've got some kind of internal reaction against your Oedipus complex. And or in the case of Marxism, if whatever happens is interpreted as supporting the Marxist interpretation of history. So Popper thought that there were a lot of theories that were imperfectly scientific because they never allowed anything to count as evidence against them. To take maybe a somewhat controversial example, an example that I've heard people recently talking about, some people have raised this objection against supporters of the war in Iraq, where if terrorist incidents increase, they say, oh, well, this is more evidence then that we need to keep on fighting the war on terror. And if terrorist incidents decrease, they say, well, this is more evidence that the war on terror is working. So this is Popper's critique, and that's why Popper thought that in order for something to be scientific, you have to be able to say what would count as evidence against it. And so this is why Friedman, coming from a Popperian position, is suspicious of the Austrian approach, or at least the Austrian approach as Mises pursues it, because Mises bases his economic theory on these self-evident principles, on the axiom of action, on various conceptual truths about action, and there isn't anything that would count as evidence against them. What would count as evidence against the fact that whenever you act, you choose your most highly valued preference? Because you do something different from what we expected, but then we'd just take that as evidence that that wasn't your highly valued preference after all. However, what Mises could say in response is, well, these other theories, the theories that Popper was criticizing, or at least the versions of those theories that he was criticizing, because perhaps not all Marxists or Freudians were guilty of this, but those who never took anything to count as evidence against their theories, well, their theories weren't supposed to be self-evident. Their theories weren't supposed to be a priori true. They were supposed to be based on, in Marx's case, based on a study of history, in Freud's case, based upon studies of human psychology, So those were supposed to be, at least in large part, empirical theories. If you've got an empirical theory, then it is a problem for the theory, if no empirical evidence is allowed to come against it. But if you're dealing with conceptual truth, it's not so clear that that's the case. In the case of logic and mathematics, for example, nothing counts as evidence against 2 + 2 = 4. What would count as evidence against it? You could put 2 things down, another 2 things down, and count them, see if they add up to 4. But in real life, you had to put 2 water droplets down, another 2 water droplets down, and they all merge into one big drop. But you don't conclude, aha, so 2 + 2 = 1. Or if you put 2 rabbits in a box, another 2 rabbits in the box, and you come back a little later, there might be 18 rabbits. But again, you don't conclude, oh, 2 + 2 must equal 18. None of those things ever count against, as evidence against the claim, because the claim that 2 + 2 = 4 is a conceptual truth. It's not a claim that if you have 2 things at one time and another 2 things at that time, then you'll have 4 things at some later time. It's not a causal claim. It's a claim about just what counts as having 2 things and another 2 things. So, from Mises' standpoint, what mistake is Friedman making? Well, this whole thing about how if praxeologists disagree, they would simply have to come to blows. I think here's what's going on. When Friedman hears Mises and other Austrians talk about appeal to self-evident truths, here's how Friedman is picturing it. He's picturing it as though you're appealing to some sort of inner revelation. It's like an inner voice talking to you, or you're having some sort of inner vision. There's a little inner revelation going on. And suppose that I've got some inner revelation going on in me, and you've got some inner revelation going on in you, and they disagree. Well, I can't get my revelation into your head, you can't get your revelation into my head, and so obviously there's no basis for progress there. I'm just having this intuitive feeling that something is true, and you're having the same intuitive feeling about something else, and you can see that if that's the case, there'd be no progress. And so, I think Friedman is thinking that appealing to self-evident truths is like appealing to some sort of intuitive feel that something must be right. And, of course, people could have different intuitive feels about what's right, and there might then be no progress. So he's thinking as though, having a self-evident truth is like having some sort of private episode. However, think about the analogy with logic and mathematics. It seems like those aren't really a private realm. When you see that 2 + 2 = 4, you're not having some sort of private inner revelation. Logic and mathematics are public in the same way that empirical evidence is public. I think there's a useful example from the logician Gottlob Frege, one of the 2 greatest logicians in history, I think, the other one being Aristotle. He drew a distinction between the inner realm, the outer realm, and the third realm. These are 3 kinds of objects of knowledge. The inner realm is subjective stuff going on in our minds. Like, if you're feeling an itch right now, or some thought you're having, or some feeling you're having, and something that's going on in you that is private to you. It's your own feeling, and I can't have that feeling. I can have a different one, but not that one. The outer realm is the realm of public objects that are accessible to the senses. So your itch is in the inner realm, but this piece of paper is in the outer realm. It's public for all of us to see. But the third realm, for Frege, is the realm of logical and mathematical truth. It's like the inner realm in that it's not grasped through the senses. But it's like the outer realm in being public. I can't have your itch. I can have an itch just like yours, maybe, but I can't have your itch. I can't feel your pain. Not really. But if you think 2 + 2 = 4 and I think 2 + 2 = 4, it's not like we've each got our own little 2 + 2 = 4. You're talking about the same 2 and 2 and 4 that I am. Logic and mathematics are public. They're just not physical or perceptible through the senses. And Frege identifies as what he calls psychologism, the confusion of logic with psychology, particularly the confusion of the inner realm with the third realm. And part of the reason for this confusion is that a lot of our language is sort of ambiguous. Think of words like idea, concept, It's not always clear whether by that we mean an inner realm item or a third realm item. Sometimes by an idea or a concept, you mean something in your head. And you could have an idea, and I can't have that same idea. Your idea is a particular thing going on in your mind. And my idea is going on in my mind. They're different mental events or mental states. We can't have the same one. But there's another sense of idea where, if I've got an idea and I try to convince you of it and I succeed, then you've got the same idea I have. It's not like you've got some other idea. It's the difference, in effect, between the act of thinking and the content of thinking. If we're both thinking, we can't have the same act of thinking. Your act of thinking is yours. It belongs to you. My act of thinking is mine. It belongs to me. Those are inner realm items. But the content of what we're thinking can be the same. Yes?
Is the third realm kind of a Platonist realm then?
Well, it needn't, something like that. It needn't have those metaphysical connotations. It needn't, we needn't think of it as a realm of entities really existing off on their own. This is simply a way of categorizing different objects of knowledge, but this doesn't commit you to any particular view about the metaphysical status of them. And, in fact, Frege is kind of slippery as to exactly what he thinks the status of them is. He says things that sound very Platonic, but he also says things that sound like he's not. And different followers of Frege took him in different directions. We can distinguish between a logical and a psychological conception of self-evidence. Psychological self-evidence, I think, is what Friedman is thinking of when he hears the Austrians talking about these self-evident things. The psychological self-evidence would be, I've got some private feeling that just is overwhelming to me. I've just got this intuitive feeling that something is true. But if you don't have it, there's nothing I can do. But logical self-evidence is not just this intuitively strong feeling. Logical self-evidence is something you can show that is somehow incoherent to deny certain things. It's incoherent to deny 2 + 2 = 4. It's incoherent to deny the law of non-contradiction. So I think that's how Misesians can respond to Friedman on that point. And I'll say a little later that I think that the next point about Friedman is importantly related to the first point, although it may not seem so initially. Part of the disagreement between Friedman and the Austrians, what initially looks like a completely different disagreement, is of the question of realism. Austrians often criticize the neoclassical mainstream for using unrealistic models. For example, the perfect competition model, where you have many firms, in effect infinitely many firms, and they all have perfect information, and any information is instantly transmitted all at once through the entire economy, and things like that. And Austrians always want to focus on the fact that there's some definite process going on, and things take time, and people don't have perfect information. Some Austrians have borrowed this line from Keynes. Keynes has this line about the dark forces of time and ignorance. And there's a book on economics, Austrian economics, called The Economics of Time and Ignorance, focusing on the fact that it's crucial that we don't have perfect knowledge and that economic processes don't happen instantaneously. In fact, there's the old joke that if you see a $20 bill on the floor, you shouldn't pick it up, because according to neoclassical economics, it's not there. Any profit opportunities have already been noticed, and so that would already have been picked up. Whereas in Austrian economics, it might not have been noticed yet, and so you get to pick it up. Well, Friedman has a famous essay, The Methodology of Positive Economics, came out in 1953, in which he defends the unrealistic character of neoclassical models. In fact, he defends it even more radically than most of the mainstream would have. So, here's a quotation from that article. Friedman says, "A hypothesis is important if it explains much by little. That is, if it abstracts the common and crucial elements from the mass of complex and detailed circumstances surrounding the phenomena to be explained, and permits valid predictions on the basis of them alone. To be important, therefore, a hypothesis must be descriptively false in its assumptions. It takes account of, and accounts for, none of the many other attendant circumstances. since its very success shows them to be irrelevant for the phenomena to be explained. Truly important and significant hypotheses will be found to have assumptions that are wildly inaccurate descriptive representations of reality. And in general, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions. A theory, or its assumptions, cannot possibly be thoroughly realistic in the immediate descriptive sense so often ascribed to this term. A completely realistic theory of the wheat market would have to include not only the conditions directly underlying the supply and demand for wheat, but also the kinds of coins or credit instruments used to make exchanges, the personal characteristics of wheat traders, such as the color of each trader's hair and eyes, his antecedents in education, the number of members of his family, their characteristics, antecedents, education, etc., the kind of soil on which the wheat was grown, its physical and chemical characteristics, the weather prevailing during the growing season, the personal characteristics of the farmers growing the wheat and of the consumers who will ultimately use it, and so on indefinitely. End quote. So what Friedman is saying is that a model has to be unrealistic, because a realistic model would have to be faithful to all the complicated and detailed complexity of the real situation. It would have to include all that information. And any economic model necessarily has to leave most of that stuff out. And therefore, says Friedman, economic models have to be unrealistic. Now, those of you who were at David Gordon's talk and heard his description of the German historical school, I think that the German historical school comes close to thinking you really do need to take into account the color of the trader's eyes and so forth, or that you might in principle have to. But certainly Austrians don't. The Austrians demand realism. They don't demand that you include all that information. And so what Friedman could be saying to the Austrians is, look, you complain that our models are unrealistic, but look at you. You don't include all this information. You abstract and you simplify the situation. You leave things out and simplify it. So why can't I do it too? And as long as it becomes a good predictor, as long as the model predicts well, that's all that matters. Now, not only is this a conflict between the neoclassical mainstream and the Austrians, but it's also been a conflict to some extent within the Austrian school. Mises describes having a similar argument with his own teacher, Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk. Von Bawerk's version of the argument is not as extreme as Friedman's, but Mises, in the argument he finally developed in the theory of money and credit, argues that it's a mistake to think that when you increase the money supply, just automatically all prices increase everywhere. Because if that were true, it really wouldn't matter to some extent. We'd all just, the prices will all go up, but the money in your pockets will all go up in proportion to it, and so there'd be no real dislocation. You just have to keep track of these new rising prices. But today you've got $1 in your pocket, and what you want to buy costs $1, and then bang, after inflation, you've got $2 in your pocket, and what you want to buy costs $2. So inflation obviously doesn't do you any good, but it doesn't do you any harm either. But Mises argued that it's not quite true, because the money doesn't enter the economy equally everywhere all at once. And once again, processes take time. And not everyone knows about the new money instantly. So the people who get the new money first are still facing the old prices, so they're systematically advantaged. By the time the prices start rising, there'll be some people who have to pay the new higher prices when they don't have the new increased money yet. And so, in fact, it causes all sorts of dislocations over the economy. And, in fact, has the effect of redistributing money from some parts of the economy to the others. So Mises said, look, it's a mistake to think that money just automatically, an increase in money just automatically raises prices equally throughout the economy. It's not realistic. And Böhm-Bawerk replied, and here's what Mises says about his argument with Böhm-Bawerk. Böhm-Bawerk raised no objection against the cogency of my step-by-step analysis. He did not deny its results, namely that changes in purchasing power of money cause prices of different commodities and services to change neither simultaneously nor evenly, and that it is incorrect to maintain that changes in the quantity of money bring about simultaneous and proportional changes in the level of prices. But he maintained that this was a friction phenomenon. According to him, the old doctrine was correct in principle, It maintains its full significance for an analysis aimed at purely economic action. In real life, there was resistance and friction, which caused the result to deviate from that arrived at theoretically. I tried in vain to convince von Bauwerk of the inadmissibility of metaphors borrowed from mechanics. So, von Bauwerk seems to hold a milder version of Friedman's view. I think the reason it's milder is that I think von Bauwerk thinks that these economic principles are approximately true or roughly true, even if they're not precisely so. Whereas for Friedman, they don't have to be true at all. As long as they're good predictors, they can just be wildly false. But where Friedman and von Bauwerk seem to agree is they both seem to think that the theory doesn't really have to be realistic. It doesn't have to answer to the way things are. Well, what can an Austrian say in response? Well, I think that part of what's going on here is a disagreement or confusion about the nature of abstraction. Friedman makes the point that in doing economics we have to abstract from all these particular details of hair color and the precise height of the farmer and all that. We have to leave it out. And he thinks of leaving it out as a matter of coming up with a simplified model that, by being simplified, is inaccurate. It leaves out stuff that's true of reality. Well, this really goes back to a debate between Plato and Aristotle on the nature of abstraction, and also to some of the other people around at the same time. Take something like the concept of a dog. The concept of a dog is not the concept of any particular kind of dog or any particular breed of dog. If you talk about what a dog is, you're not talking about some particular collie or cocker spaniel or something. You're just talking about dogs in general. And so when you say the concept of a dog isn't the concept of any particular kind of dog. And so you might easily conclude that it's the concept of a very odd creature, something that's a dog without being any particular breed. So you ask, is it large or small? Is it got pointy ears or floppy ears? Well, no, it's just the dog as such. What is this thing, the dog as such? Well, Plato concluded that there really must be a dog as such, a dog that isn't a dog of any particular breed. And obviously all the dogs that we encounter in real life are always dogs of some particular breed. So the dog as such must be some very mysterious thing existing off in Platonic heaven. Or likewise, to take an example I think Plato was more interested in, you're doing mathematics. If you're adding 2 and 2 to get 4, well, what are the two you're adding? It's not just that you're adding two particular things. It's not like I'm adding these two things and these two things to get 4. When I say that 2 plus 2 equals 4, I'm not talking about any particular 2. I'm talking about the 2 as such. So where is this 2 as such? We never encountered in empirical reality. All things we encounter are always some definite 2. When we say that 2 plus 2 equals 4, we're proving something about the 2 as such. And so Plato thought the 2 as such had to exist off in Platonic heaven. Now he thought there was such a thing, but a lot of philosophers at the time thought, well, there is no such thing, and therefore abstraction must falsify. The concept of dog is a false concept because it's not the concept of any particular dog. It's the concept of some dog that is of no particular breed. This is when Aristotle comes along, and Aristotle argues that abstraction does not falsify, and it also does not apply to some mysterious realm beyond the ordinary. According to Aristotle, the concept of a dog doesn't refer to some dog off in Platonic heaven. It refers to the real individual dogs of ordinary experience. The concept dog does not include the particular breed, but it doesn't deny that it has a particular breed. So Aristotle wants to distinguish between a concept that fails to specify certain things versus a concept that specifies that they're not the case. There's a difference between a concept of a dog that doesn't specify any particular breed versus the concept of a dog that has no particular breed. Or likewise with the number 2. For Aristotle, the number 2 refers to any duo. it refers to this, it refers to any two things you like. So Aristotle thought that these abstract concepts don't refer to different things, different entities from ordinary concrete ones. They refer to the same usual ones, but they refer to them differently. They don't specify the absence of these properties, they simply fail to specify their presence. And this notion got more fully developed later on by the scholastics in this distinction between precisive abstraction and non-precisive abstraction. Precisive abstraction is when you actually specify that something is omitted. You actually specify that the thing you're talking about does not have the property. Non-precisive abstraction is you simply fail to specify the property. So here we have a quote from Aquinas explaining this. Aquinas says, "Abstraction may occur in two ways. First, we may understand that one thing does not exist in some other, or that it is separate from it. That's going to be precisive abstraction. Secondly, we understand one thing without considering another. That's non-precisive. Thus, for the intellect to abstract one from another, things which are not really abstract from one another, does in the first mode of abstraction imply falsehood. In other words, precisive abstraction does falsify. But in the second mode of abstraction, for the intellect to abstract things which are not really abstract from one another does not involve falsehood. If, therefore, the intellect is said to be false, when it understands a thing otherwise than as it is, that is so if the word otherwise refers to the thing understood. Hence, the intellect would be false if it abstracted the species of a stone from its matter in such a way as to think that the species did not exist in matter, as Plato held. But it is not so if otherwise be taken as referring to the one who understands." Okay, so let's try to make this distinction clearer with an example. Suppose that I consider the concept of soul. The soul is the living and conscious aspects of a human being. So I focus on your soul without focusing on your body. I don't think about your body one or the other. I just think about the respects in which you are living and conscious, and not think about the respects in which you're made of some particular lump of matter. In that sense, the concept of the soul doesn't include your body. But it doesn't mean that the soul does or can exist unembodied, disembodied. It doesn't settle that question one or the other. I'm not asserting that you don't have a body. I'm simply focusing on one aspect and ignoring the other side. And so that's guaranteed to be accurate. Whereas if instead I form the concept of soul existing without a body, now maybe that's possible, but at any rate it doesn't correspond to the way you actually exist now. Instead I'm actually specifying that something is left out rather than failing to specify that it's there. For those of you familiar with Ayn Rand's epistemology, she talks about the idea of measurement omission, that when you form a concept, you specify that a certain property has to exist in some respect, but you don't specify precisely the degree or kind or way that it that exists. There's a difference between measurement omission and measurement exclusion. If I form a concept that actually claims that certain properties are absent from the thing that really has those properties, then my concept is false, at least false of the things I'm talking about. It might be hypothetically true of something else, but it's false of the concretes that I've actually based my concept on. But if I simply fail to specify them, that's another matter. So, for example, in the case of forming the concept of a dog, it's not that I specify that it's a dog without any particular breed. It's rather that I simply fail to specify the breed. There's a big difference between failing to specify the breed and specifying the absence of a breed. Now, a dog that is not of any particular breed would be a very strange thing. But when I form the concept, when I think about the dog without thinking about the breed, I'm not trying to think of a dog that has no breed. Instead, I'm thinking about the dog without thinking of its breed. so, if you think of it this way, then the Austrian objection to Friedman is going to be when he slides from saying that your explanation has to leave out the height of the farmers and their eye color and their education. When you slide from saying that to saying that therefore it has to falsify the situation. You will falsify the situation if you specify that the farmer doesn't have any particular height or weight or hair color. That would be a very strange thing to specify. But if you merely have a non-precise abstraction, you merely fail to specify the presence of those particular qualities. That's not the same as specifying their absence. And so, when Austrians claim that theories ought to be realistic, that doesn't mean that they think that they have to include all the information. It simply means that they shouldn't specify the absence of anything that's really there. So a perfect information model, for example, actually specifies that these people don't have ignorance. Now you could, if you wanted, simply fail to specify whether they have ignorance or not, and it would get you somewhere. But if you actually specify the ignorance is absent, then that's what's untrue to reality. If you merely fail to specify the ignorance is present, then your theory is not false. It's probably going to be bad theory because you're leaving out something important to the explanation. And the hair and eye color are not important to the explanation. Whereas to understand the economy, if you leave out the ignorance, and the fact about ignorance, you're going to have a misunderstanding or fail to grasp what's important. But at least your theory won't be false. You might say, well, does this mean that Austrians don't use precise abstractions? Do they not use any unrealistic models? Well, actually, Austrians do use some unrealistic models, but they use them in a very different way. Take, for example, the evenly rotating economy, or the ERE. You remember this from the song last night, where ERE is our motto, eat spaghetti and risotto. The evenly rotating economy, or ERE, is an unrealistic situation. It's a situation in which there's no economic change. Exactly the same economic processes go on from time to time, so there are no surprises. Everyone knows what to expect. Prices never change, and so on. Excuse me. So you might say, if Austrians use that, aren't they using an unrealistic model? Well, sure, but what are they using it for? The evenly rotating economy is not meant to describe or be an approximation to or be a way of predicting or explaining the actual world. The evenly rotating economy is not supposed to be a description of the actual world. It certainly is not supposed to generate predictions. The whole point of the evenly rotating economy is it's different from what happens in the actual world. The point of the evenly rotating economy is to help you grasp certain things. And one way of putting it is that sometimes a precise abstraction can be useful to help you form a non-precise abstraction. If there are two things that you're having trouble distinguishing, then imagining a situation where one is present and the other is absent can help you form the concepts and distinguish the concepts so that you'll still be able to distinguish them even when they're mixed together. So, for example, one feature of the evenly rotating economy is that since everything is predictable, you know exactly what tomorrow's prices are going to be. You don't have risk. Investments don't have any risk because you know exactly what people's buying habits are going to be. You know exactly how much money you'll be able to make from anything you do. So there's no risk in the evenly rotating economy. But there still is time preference. You still prefer being paid now to being paid later. And if someone offers you a choice between money now and money later, the money later has got to be more than the money now in order to get you to prefer it. That's still true in the evenly rotating economy. And so if someone is having trouble distinguishing the aspect of interest that comes purely from time preference from the aspect of interest that comes from the risk of not being repaid, if you couldn't distinguish those two, had trouble distinguishing them, imagining a situation where they're different can help you distinguish them. Because you could say, oh, all right, there wouldn't be risk, but there'd still be interest. And so you're then able better to recognize these categories when you find them in realistic situations. But this isn't supposed to describe the world. It's just like the Robinson Crusoe case, where you have in Man, Economy, and State, Rothbard starts off imagining Crusoe on a desert island all by himself. And you can say, well, that's not realistic. That's not how we actually find economic. It's very unusual for anyone to be stranded on a desert island. That's not how economics works. Well, sure. But if you want to grasp certain very basic economic concepts, considering the one-person case first can help you grasp them so that you'll then recognize them again when you come across them later. So unrealistic models can have their uses for Austrians, but their use is not as a description of the real world. Part of the point often is the contrast between it and the real world. Now, I said that I thought that both Friedman's critique of a priorism and his critique of realism were importantly connected. Here's how. Remember that in the case of this is psychologism, it's a distinction of the third realm and the inner realm, there was, I said, a confusion between the act of thinking and the content of thinking. If I think it's hot outside and you think it's hot outside, we have two different acts of thinking. My act of thinking is an act of my mind. Your act of thinking is an act of your mind. And we can't share those. My act is a particular mental event going on in me, and your act is a particular mental event going on in you. So you have two different acts of thinking. But those two acts have the same content. They both affirm the same proposition, that it's hot outside. So when Friedman thinks that self-evidence would have to be a matter of some inner little voice talking to you, he's thinking as though it's all about the act of thinking. I've got my act of thinking, you've got your act of thinking, we've each got our private world of thinking, and given that, there's no possibility of any progress, so instead we should turn to empirical evidence. But even if our acts of thinking are private, the content of thinking can be public. We can both recognize the same content of thinking and argue about that. And therefore we can do exactly what Friedman says, which is to, as he puts it, try to find a logical flaw in one another's thing. And the way he puts it seems to suggest that he doesn't take that very seriously. You can try to find a logical flaw in one another's thing. Well, what's wrong with trying to find a logical flaw in one another's thing? He seems to think that that would be hopeless. But in fact, if the content of the proposition is something that's public for both of us, even if the acts of thinking are private, the content is public and we can argue about it. Well, I think the same confusion between precisive and non-precisive abstraction also involves confusing the act and the content. The act of thinking, when I think of the concept dog, the act of thinking doesn't include the particular breed. And so you might think that therefore the content of thinking, what I'm thinking of, dog, must be a dog that lacks a particular breed. Or likewise, if my act of thinking, my economic theory, doesn't include the particular height and weight of the farmers, then the content of thinking, what I'm thinking about, the farmers I'm thinking about, must be farmers without any height or weight. Again, I think this is a confusion of the act of the content. And it comes from confusing, it comes from psychologism, confusing inner realm acts of thinking from third realm contents of thinking. Just because my thought about the farmers doesn't include the height, doesn't mean that the farmers I'm thinking about, be they real farmers or imaginary farmers, either way, doesn't mean that I'm thinking about them as lacking height and weight. There's a difference between failing to think about them as having height and weight and thinking about them as lacking height and weight. All our thoughts leave things out in the sense that right now, until I mentioned it, you probably weren't thinking about this room as having white walls. It's not as though you were thinking about the room as not having white walls. And if you weren't thinking about the walls at all, it doesn't mean you're thinking about the room as not having walls. There's a difference between thinking that something is absent and not thinking, and failing to think of it as present. So that, I think, is what the Austrians should say to Friedman. That if you confuse the act of thinking with the content of thinking, then you're going to think of self-evidence as some sort of private episode of mental revelation, rather than thinking of it as a public logical thing that we can both assess. And you're going to think that any model that leaves something out is thereby false, and therefore you think, all right, well, once we've got false models, we might as well go ahead and make them even more wildly false. Because for Friedman, and again, this is part of the Popperian thing, I think. For Friedman, the whole point of economics is prediction. And so if you've got a wildly false theory, he thinks it doesn't matter as long as it generates the right predictions. But for Austrians, what this crucially leaves out is explanation. We don't just want to be able to predict what will happen. And Austrians think that there are limits to how much we're really able to predict anyway. What we want is explanation. And obviously a false theory cannot explain why it's happened. And that's relevant to prediction, because if you don't have the explanation for why it's happened, then you're not really going to be in a good position to know how to predict. For example, a few years ago there was good statistical evidence there was going to be a Lord of the Rings movie every year, because one year there was one, and the next year around the same time there was another one. Next year at the same time there was another one. So if you just were going by statistical evidence and you didn't have any understanding of why this was happening, you just noticed the statistical correlation, you would have predicted the year after that there would be a fourth one. The prediction that the theory that there is some cosmic force that produces a Lord of the Rings movie every year would have been a good predictor for those first 3 years. But in the fourth year, it would have gone wrong, which is exactly how this sort of statistical economics often seems to work. You'll find some trend, and there's evidence that it continues, and say, aha, we found an economic law, and then the trend runs out. And if you don't know the explanation, you don't know why. Now, if you knew what these movies were, you knew that they're based on a book that only had 3 parts, and each movie was corresponded to one of the parts, then you weren't surprised when there was no fourth one. But if you were just going by statistics and not understanding the concepts, then you'd be surprised. So even in terms of prediction, I think that you're better off with prediction if you can understand what's happening, and you can't understand what's happening if you are relying on false models, because the false models won't tell you what's going on. Okay, questions? Yeah.
Are you saying in the example there of Lord of the Rings that the neoclassical economists would try to tell because of the causal explanations for the Lord of the Rings movie solely hold constant as the rational judges?
Yeah, I think what they'd say is, look, we want a theory that will predict the pattern we actually observe. And the theory that there's a cosmic force that reliably produces a Lord of the Rings movie every year accurately predicts what we've observed so far. And, of course we know there isn't really any such force, but it predicts everything so far. But if you don't understand why, then you're not going to be able to, you'll be surprised when the train runs out.
What do you mean by cosmic force?
Well, I was just giving an example of an implausible theory which would nevertheless correctly predict for a while the recurrence of these movies.
And wouldn't the neoclassical say that cosmic force or what have you, whatever theory or whatever factor or factors they would consider Titan so far as those factors are causal, and consequently they can say always measurable or measurable and consequently constant factors like hair color of the producer of Lord of the Rings, but consider things like the market demand for the movie Lord of the Rings. Is it possible that they're delving deep into trying to consider fully the causal factors and not just correlations like what happened this year, so what will happen next year, something like that. They're actually trying their best to do that. They can't take into account certain information and consequently they're saying perhaps we believe, use a 3 out of 4 chance, for instance, or confidence interval to 95%
Well, I mean, certainly I don't think that this account of how you ought to do economics, Friedman's account, according to which you just, it doesn't matter how realistic or unrealistic the theory is as long as it has good predictions. I don't think that mainstream economists consistently go by this. I think that they go by it more than often than they should. But Walter Block has this story about when he was a grad student and was working on his dissertation under various classical and Chicago type economists, and he was going out to investigate the effects of things like the price controls. And whenever he got statistical evidence that conflicted with what the praxeologist would expect, the economist said, "Well, you must have done something wrong. Go back and try again." So what Professor Block thinks is that his teachers were implicitly praxeological, but their official theory was that you should just go by whatever the model predicts and whether you satisfy these statistical correlations, and they were violating their own method, and they do better economics when they violate their own official method.
So, Ron, in conclusion, the Austrian Economics report that neoclassical economic models to no extent can predict various economic phenomena, or do they say that to that extent, perhaps, or they say that extent can be limited, consequently, perhaps using motives in a way. Throw the baby out with the bathwater and not even use any predictive models to try to show this sort of extent. And I'm not saying that there's an informed public policy based on these models that will not like that.
Well, I mean, there is a role for things like statistics and so forth in Austrian economics. This would come under the realm of, not of praxeology, but of what they call themology, which is when you apply praxeological concepts to interpreting particular concrete historical situations. So it's not as though Austrians are against, for example, all use of statistical data. They don't think this is... Well, I mean, the Austrians don't really talk in terms of models, really, but well, I'm not sure that. Yeah, I'm not sure how much is just a terminological point, but certainly what they would say is that you don't use statistical data to establish the praxeological laws, but in figuring out how to apply those to concrete situations, then statistical data is perfectly fine. Well, I think we should move on to make sure we get there. Right. Yeah.
In regards to the problem of aggregation, I definitely see how Mises is exposing the problems that they generally were theorizing. In the sense that, like your dog example, if you average, say, household size across America, you might come up with something like the average family has 2.5 children. And in doing that average, you said an accurate statement about the whole system, but an incorrect statement about each individual, because no particular family has 2.5 children. It's like, yes, it's a dog and well, this is great in macroeconomics or different systems or what types of forces we can elucidate in economics throughout the entire economy. But what about asking different questions framed in a more institutional perspective, like, say, of political economy or what is and not successful politics, in the sense that to what extent when we talk about the interaction that takes place of the dogness and the way people perceive dogs, or if you were to say, has drawn a dog on the board when you were talking about it, then each of us goes out, and now that influences our impression of what we perceive as a dog. So then the signal and the symbol eventually changes over time or various things. How does the a priorism and the deductive reasoning process talk about being as like a linear process? How does that handle the circular influence of both subjective interpretation and then the influential perception of the symbol itself?
Well, I'm not sure that it changes. I'm not sure that it changes the concept. I mean, the interpretation part is on the themology side, but the concept applied really does apply to all dogs of any kind. And if I draw a picture of a dog a particular kind of dog, I mean, I'm not sure what that might lead you to do, but would it lead you to change your concept?
Well, it would certainly give me a visual representation that I didn't have before you drew it.
Yeah, but the visual representation isn't the concept. It's just a guide to applying the concept. Yeah.
What can we do both? Why can't we both use models and deduction? I mean, that's what real science does. You know, that's what physics does. We use models, and use data to test our model, but at the same time, we're trying to understand why the model works. We're using deduction and logic and et cetera to understand the whole thing. Why can't we do that? Why can't we do both? Why do we have to either do models or use logic?
Well, I mean, in science, I don't think that it's really that different either. I don't really think there's this. In the natural sciences, you have models that, when you have simplified models, I think that they're always one of two things. Either they're precisive abstractions that you're using to help grasp a non-precise point, or they really are non-precise abstractions. I would take the example of people sometimes say, well, you shouldn't say that the law of gravity isn't really true because it says that objects will fall straight down in the gravitational field, but things never fall straight down because there's always some other force acting on them. Well, I think you can either take that as a non-precisive abstraction that simply is talking about what it does, leaving aside the other forces, not specifying that there are no forces, but just simply leaving them aside, and saying what does it do to the extent that this is this force acting on it. Or you're talking about an imaginary situation, like sort of a physical equivalent of even the rotating economy, an imaginary situation where there really are no other forces, and then you see just what it does in that situation, so you can distinguish its role from the role of other forces once they're put together. So I don't think that in either case, the models in science are falsifying. They're either a non-precisive abstraction, which is absolutely true of reality, or they're a precisive abstraction, which isn't meant to describe reality as it really is. It's simply meant to help us identify the specific contribution of one thing as opposed to another.
Why can't we apply the same idea to economics?
Yeah, I think that is what we do.
If we've got a model that, I understand that what you're saying. It's foolish just to say, well, I've got a model that works, therefore I've identified something about reality. No, you haven't necessarily. But if you've got a model that works, then you can start developing theories about reality, and you can keep testing, and you can use logic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, if you've got a model like, equilibrium theory, and it seems to work, and you're like, well, I have identified something that seems to have something to do with reality, let's find out why. And if it keeps working and nothing contradicts it, then we've got not necessarily a truth in the model, but a model that helps us find truth.
Yeah, I don't think I have any objection to that.
If the processes of the market are controlled by forces of nature, then, once we figure it out, we can figure it out. I mean, not anyone needs to solve a problem with a model to find the future, but when we try to see if we can sustain it, we can do it absolutely. I think a lot of time, at least fundamentally, I have problems with that idea that you can predict the future. Well, I think we can make one, too, that there are, you can make observations that call your attention to certain problems, but the exploration of those problems must be done through the deductivist method when we're talking about human beings. So that, when we say, I have an example of the Phillips curve, right, where the economist noticed a relationship and tried to draw an inference, and one that held up for several decades. But I think Mises would say, well, that calls your attention to a particular problem. What you need to do is now use the top prioristic approach to really determine what is going on. So in that sense, you're using both. But to really get answers as to why these things are occurring, his method is the only true method. And whereas, if you look at what happened in the economic community, they kept trying to come up with all these ways of explaining the Phillips curve. Most of them were spurious. And then when the 70s rolled around, that got really ridiculous in terms of how they were trying to preserve this relationship that they have observed. So I mean, I just think that in practice, that approach leads you to so many blind alleys, which are consistently under review. Whereas to really truly understand the economic human behavior, these are the approaches that the best way.
Yeah.
Further clarification of properties involved, whether it's properties or not, simply does not make the additional predictability or generalization of the further generalization of maybe I'll jump into the topic. Is that the underlying problem?
I'm not sure I quite followed that. You start off with induction and deduction, and then I lost you.
Sorry, I was trying to throw out buckets in case there rings a bell, and I could put the quarter in. If you gave up gravity, for example, there's gravity. Well, it's not incorrect. It's because the level that's being applied is pillars. The way you're categorizing gravity is the same way that you were to apply the answer. The level of granularity that we're trying to apply that. Further description of it, in the case of gravity, in certain circumstances, it has greater clarity and so model or some solution that everything else. Further explanation of supply and answer again doesn't alter the nature of supply and answer. It simply provides greater transfer power to the things that can be put generalized.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say that the law of gravity is we could say it's not false because it's useful. I mean, I think the reason it's useful is that it's true, and what's true is the non-precise version, and then the precise version is simply helping us to distinguish its role from other things' role in the non-precise version. I think that's what I want to say. Yeah.
But something doesn't have to be true to be useful. I mean, it is useful to say that the Earth is a sphere. It's not. It's an oblate spheroid, and even that's incorrect because it's an imperfect oblate spheroid. But for most purposes, we can model.
Well, to how many significant figures?
And fly from point A to point B, and it's great. And so.
I think the Earth is a sphere because if we talk about how many significant figures, I mean, obviously it's not a sphere down to the last significant figure, but within a certain margin, it really falls within that spherical margin. So I think
squares. I mean, in that sense too.
Aren't you effectively doing right there?
No, I don't see that.
They're saying to a certain percent interval, given certain limitations, the Earth is a sphere, and based on the limiting nature of the assumptions and what's held constant, we can then define, is the Earth really a sphere? I say we hold constant, relative differences in peaks and valleys of height overall. We can say it's a sphere, but then we need to go back and reconsider to what extent those assumptions play out and affect the predictive capacity of the notion of the Earth being a sphere.
But when I say the Earth is a sphere, I don't mean that it's a sphere in the geometrical sense of having constant curvature no matter how finely you go. But I think the notion of significant figures is useful here. I mean, there's a difference between saying something is 5 inches long and saying it's 5.0 inches long and saying it's 5.00 inches long. Those mean different things. And it's not as though when you say it's 5 inches long, it's not as though that's merely an approximation. It really is literally 5 inches long, but that doesn't mean it's 5.00.
But your logic before was that you feel the Earth is a sphere, although it has volcanoes and mountains.
I'm not talking.
The salient feature is the elevation and the linear plane of the Earth.
It's a sphere within certain significant figures.
It's more or less a sphere. You consider the sphere because we can hold constant the elevation, so your example.
No, I don't want to hold constant the elevation.
5.0 or 5.00. If you say.
I don't want to hold constant the elevation. I want to use units that are broad enough so that using height units that are broad enough that the volcanoes just fall inside them.
So the units hold constant effectively the height of the volcanoes, therefore the elevation.
Well, effectively hold constant the height of the volcano. I don't think you could put it that way, but it's not as though they that they are asserting that there is no deviation in height. They're simply leaving out, not asserting the absence of, but leaving out, failing to specify the presence of any deviations of height within that boundary. So again, it's the difference between specifying something's absence and not specifying its presence. That's the sense in which I want to say the Earth is a sphere. It's a sphere in the sense that you define the sphere in terms of these length units, and if you use length units large enough, then it works out. But I think we are out of time.